Okay, so for week 9, we're going to write some custom validation. So up until this point, as a review, we've been using validation so that when we're including the required attribute, we're doing min, max, right? Those types of, and required here, right? Those types are built into the HTML. We have had to do no coding to handle the condition of it being not correct, the inputs that we're looking for. So in this case, we're going to write some custom validation because it really is what you want to do. You don't want to rely on the HTML, and Daniel posted this, and I said at the time he's absolutely right on, because I knew we'd come back around to write some. But I thought it's good to learn both, that there is that option, but you also want to write custom form validation as really the probably better practice. Okay, so set up your week 9 pub from your week 8 private. And here's what you're going to want to do. For this assignment, I'm only going to require, and this is probably redundant here, you to write custom validation for first and last names. But in order for you to do that and to see it work, you have to remove the required attribute that we have on the HTML. So if I go over to my HTML and I pull up the index here, right? So what we're talking about is, and actually I've already modified this a little bit, but this is the required here. You can see I've already taken it off of the labels because that's my solution for the HTML. Okay, so first do that so that from now on, and here's what happens as soon as you do that. If you try to submit the form, these will still stop you, okay? But in that case, it will allow you to submit the form without first and last name, which is what we're coding for, okay? So just know that. What we're coding for is both to write custom code here and to also stop the form submission from actually doing the work of calculating a carbon footprint, right? Rendering the table and now pushing, right? Saving it. All that work should only be done if we get good input. So we're handling that, right? So we're handling the form validation ourselves. For this, I've given you two options. I actually thought a bit about this because in the first case, right, and you can choose whichever path you want, but what I want you to make sure you understand is neither of these paths are going to give you 100%, but it's going to get you very close to the solution. Okay, so the first one is some sample code I got from doing some prompting with ChatGPT. And the reason I didn't provide the prompts like I've done in the past is that I couldn't recreate the prompts to get to this code. So I decided I would just give you the code because that actually can be one of the things with giving prompts depending on what version of chat you're using, right? So just FYI, that's why I've given you this particular link, which we'll come back and look at it in a minute. And I said integrate this into the main JS, but it's true also for this second one as well. Now this second one is actually a video from one of my favorite YouTubers, Web Dev Simplified, and this video is a little dated and it's what I've done in the past for form validation, but I really kind of wanted to up the game a little bit. In this case, and there's the video, you can actually follow through. There are going to be, it's a little dated, it's 4 years old, it's fine though. I think using this particular one is fine. You are going to see a little difference in the way that he writes the event listener and some other things. You can see he puts a div that's an error above it. Okay. Really where it starts to get a little different is when he writes the event listener itself. Let me go show you that. In this case, he's writing, there we go. Here's writing the event listener. He's actually writing the event listener using, let me get to that point so you can see it, is that he's using the submit as we've done, right? He's not capitalizing form, which is fine. I do that more as a naming standard, right? But he is capturing the E, right? So E prevent default. But in this case, it's not like a function we've seen in the past. This is an arrow function. We're going to see this actually in week 10. We're going to re-look at functions and learn how to write and the differences between. This is a concise format for writing a function, but it is still a function. In this case, and now here are the steps in the function. Okay, so that's one thing you see different. And when he's writing this, right? So he's setting up an array, and then what he does is based on the condition, so like name, because he's given the name, right? Remember we did name equal, and for I think we gave it a different name, but that's what this is equal to empty string, or if the name is equal to what? Oh yeah, if it's null. Okay, so these are the two conditions that he's checking for, and if that's the case, it says pushing into this array a string that says name is required. And then he goes on, so he's saying he's going to check all these conditions, and then at the end what he'll end up doing, and he'll do password, which is kind of a fun one, but we're doing first and last. Okay, and then he'll end up doing that error element that he's pointed to above, and he's saying enter text, which we've done text content, and then got messages.join. So what this does is it takes, if you're checking for multiple conditions, for us, first and last name, right? And again, if you felt like this was like it made sense, you could also actually write condition for the other ones as well, but at minimum make sure you get first and last. And then this join takes whatever items are in the array and it outputs it to this element, and that's how he handles it. Now the thing I don't necessarily love about this is that there's no styling on here, and it only happens, and this is the key, this validation only happens when you hit the submit. On the other option I'm going to show you, it actually will happen, there'll be some validation that will happen as soon as you exit the field, and I'll talk about that next. But I just wanted to give you, like, here's the example you're going to see. If you want to follow his, this will be done all inside the event listener. Okay, that's option 1. And again, oh sorry, actually it's option 2. Okay, again, you're doing it in the main JS. But in the sample code example, and this is the one that I have open here, is there is another event listener for the input field and for the last name, and I'll show you this in a minute. And as soon as you tab into it, that actually is what we call focus. It actually has a focus if we were listening for a focus event, but what we're going to listen for is called a blur event. And a blur event says anytime this input field loses focus, do something. And as soon as I either tab out, right, or I click something else, like if I clicked over here, as soon as that input loses focus, and that's an on blur, then it runs whatever code I've set up for the event listener. Okay, so I think this is a little more user friendly, so it doesn't wait until they've hit submit. And I believe, and I'm sorry I don't remember who it was, is already doing some of this actually when they tab through, or when they input values here, it tells them the carbon footprint, and that's awesome. But I just want to tell you the other, right, so this is called blur, right? So if I tap in here, tap out, I can also, right, get that message. Now this message is being handled, and let me just show you this now that I go to the sample code, which is here, with some styling. So it's styled as an error, and when it's invalid, it does that border. Okay, so that border was right there. You saw that. Okay, and that error is, that style is right there, which by the way, if I right click, I can go down to inspect to see that. And that is really good to start kind of playing around with. But coming back here, so let's talk about what's changed here. Inside the form now, right, we have an ID on the form, which I believe we didn't have before. And then there's a new thing called a span, which is basically a space. As a matter of fact, you can see it here. It's the space. It's right after the input. That's what the span does. You could have had it on another line, but that's what the span is. It's got a class of error. Now it's got a role of alert, and actually I'm going to take this off because I'll show you in a minute. I don't want you to use alert, and I'm not sure that actually points to that, but we don't use it in our example. So now we have first name and last name. You have to add them to both of it, and then there's a submit. Now this is interesting because what happens here, okay, so that's the form, that's the HTML. And then here's the script. Remember, you can't just copy and paste this directly. You're going to have to figure out how to integrate it. And I'm kind of giving you the general setup here. So what we have now is we have a function that's been set up that is not something we've seen before, which is validate field. And then we have, these are the two event listeners for first name and last name. And they're going to look a little different in that here's the blur I talked about before. But in this case, it's got a function call and not the function itself that we've been coding up until now. And this is just a little different, but it's the same basic idea. If it's listening for a blur, and when a blur is triggered, remember losing the focus on the field, then it runs this code. Now, it doesn't pass anything to it, but notice, and this might throw you off when you first see it, well then how does event get passed to it? And what happens here is because of the way the event listener handles it, whenever you put a function in here without actually passing anything, by default it'll pass in the event. And now what's kind of nice here is that this same event is being called for first and last name, and what they're doing in the logic here, and we'll just kind of briefly go through it, is they're saying, okay, the field, okay, is event target value. Now we actually haven't talked much about event target value, and it's good to know. So in this case the field would be right first name, right? So it figures out based on what you've clicked there because of the value of the target. And this is where you could go into DevTools and take a look at it. So it first gets the field, it gets the ID, so event target ID, and then it also in this case sets up a reference to the field ID here and the error. So this is where this function has some flexibility. When you pass to it, it determines based on what the target was, okay, to calculate or to reference the field for either first name or last name. That's how come this function has some built-in flexibility, which I think is really good for us to see. So now once it sets up the field that we've clicked in, the ID of that field, and it's grabbed the error, now it does some logic. If it's equal to empty string, then it says that field error that we had here, text content, which we've seen, and all it's doing here is it's setting up a template string and says is required. And that's what happens here. That's what causes that to show up, okay? So then it says else. Else, right? Else, which mean there's something in there, then it would remove, right? It would remove the invalid from that. But this is also something we could play with. So if I hit, right, then it removes that, which is really nice. So it's basically toggling between adding, and this is something we haven't seen before, but event.target, which I talked about here, right? Class list, because right now, remember the class that's setting on this is called error. And so what it does is it adds, right? If it's equal to 0, it adds the invalid. And if it's not, then it removes it. Okay, so in this case, if it was the first time you had done it, right? You could come in here, and if we looked at this in DevTools, right? If we were to look at this inside, well, let me look inside of there. Oh, I actually have to click outside, I suppose, and hit inspect. Then I could look at this to see that it had a class already right here of error. Right, but in this case, and the reason it has this else is in case you had done it before, and then it would remove that invalid there, so it shows, and it's responsive to the user. I like that. Okay, so I kind of walked you through the logic of this. I've talked about that there's two event listeners that are calling the same function. Okay, now inside, and this is, and again, it's commented out about what each of these things is doing. So this is like what we already have with an event listener on submit. Okay, so we're listening for blur here, we're listening for submit here. And now this is like what we've seen as a regular function that we've already been writing. And I say that versus what we saw over here, right? The new arrow functions. But don't let that throw you off. It's still just a function. So we prevent default, which we've been doing. Now this is kind of, when you read this, you take it into pieces. It's setting up a variable. First name is valid. Okay, so it's just a variable it's set up. And it's getting this by looking at document get element by ID first name. Now, because I've seen this here and I've seen it up here as well, I would then immediately want to set up a variable with the reference here, so I don't have to, in my code, have that entire get element by ID. But it's saying its value, okay, whatever is in that field, if it's not equal to empty string. So what's happening here is this is still validating as well, but it's not validating until you hit the submit. Okay, so we're actually just this whole validate field is really just to give the user that input. It's actually not stopping the most important thing, which is a form, from being submitted. And when you write his over here, this is actually only built into the submission. Okay, so know that there's a difference there, and I think it's good to see it. But this requires you to understand that this validation, which says, is it not equal to empty? Okay, if it's not equal to empty, that means there's something in there, then first name is valid. Same thing on last name is valid. Okay, if there's something in there, meaning not equal to empty string, then this would be true. That's what it would resolve to. And you can always copy and paste this into the console to see what it resolves to if you're not sure. And now it's going to, and this is the beginnings of, in my instruction where I talk about, right, whatever path you choose, you need to update the submission to only calculate the footprint and render the table if the first and last name is provided. Okay? So in this case, coming back here, right, it's saying if this is true, and so both of these have to be true. That's what and does, which is a perfect time to start thinking about, right, understanding, because we've done ors, we've done ands, operators. So this is, you know, both of these things have to be true because it's an and. If it was an or, only one of them in order for this line to run. Now, don't code this line the way it is. Now you can do it when you're first playing around with it, but this is what I was talking about, I believe, with the role that it has on there. But more importantly, in modern web development, we don't use alert. And the reason is most users now, because we've warned them enough that they actually have pop-up blockers that won't allow the alert to show up. And so if you're depending on the user for this, right, there's a chance it won't. So what you want to do here is think about what I listed in this line right here. What would you do? What logic? Because it's already got the beginning of it here. And you see some of the beginnings of the logic over here as well. It's just a different way to approach it, right? To say, okay, what do I want to do if I have valid first name and last name? Because I know at this point I'm relying on the HTML to validate the other two fields. Okay, so this is a good experience to have. Choose whatever path you want, right? And here, so commit, you know, before I've looked. Now, I'm writing this now, I'm including this after the week 7, is because of, you know, and I get that this can be a challenge. I get that these things can be. And what I'm trying to do in this one is give you a little more detail about how to approach it. But here's what I want to say to you, right? If you find this a bit hard and you're like, because the idea is not to be frustrated, but also to give yourself enough time to really think about and approach how you would do this, right? Reply saying what you think needs to be done, but need help, right? And if you're not getting it, now why might you not be getting it? And this very much happens is if you're doing it the night something is due, it's probably, you know, there might be somebody helping, which is great. but their chances are may not be. So what you can do is if you say I'm not, if you're not getting help, you can go, because at the point you reply here, week 9 attendance opens up and that's where the solution will be, right? And you can code up the solution and then come back here and update your post for what you've learned from coding up the solution. Because again, the idea is not to frustrate you. The idea is to help you learn. Because the way we evaluate how students learn is we give them, like, here's generally, we've shown you all the pieces. Now we're asking you to take those pieces and maybe do a little more that you haven't seen. This is true with coding, right? Okay, so I left this line in here because this is what we had originally, which was, in your code. But I'm just giving you this option now because, the idea is not to frustrate you. That honestly is not my intention. I hope this video gave you a little more guidance for the 2 paths that I've outlined here. Like I said, in the solution, I will show how to implement the sample code. I've walked through most of it today, but I will show you the final part. All right, hope this helps.